everyone. Welcome to Nature Connects. This is the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, nature experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited to have you. I'm Lauren Dowd, your host for today, and I'm really excited to be joined by Eric Fisher, Chief Meteorologist for CBS Boston's WBZ TV News. Eric anchors weather segments weeknights at 5, 6, and 11 p.m. and is also a frequent contributor to CBS News, reporting on breaking severe weather across the country on CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell. Born and raised in New England, Eric says there are few places on Earth that produce weather like this corner of the US. Eric vividly remembers the infamous Memorial Day 1995 tornado in Great Barrington, an event that helped solidify his path to becoming a meteorologist. He has previously worked as a meteorologist in Atlanta and in Springfield, Massachusetts. Today, he'll share a bit about his career in weather here in the Northeast, the relationship between weather and climate, and speaking up about climate change. After his presentation, Eric will answer your questions live. As you think of questions for him, please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much for joining today. Hey, Eric, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Lauren. All right, so here we go. Welcome everybody. Thanks for having me and including me in the talk today. I'm a meteorologist over at WBZ, down the street here in Boston, and been here for a little over 7 years now. And so we've had a great opportunity to talk about just the daily weather. Of course, our main job is the 7-day forecast, but we usually look a little farther out. Tonight we'll be doing our winter outlook, which we do every year. And we also talk about climate. And it's something that I think is important for a lot of meteorologists to discuss because a lot of people don't have a daily relationship with a scientist, and you have that opportunity when you watch the weather every night. Almost everyone, especially in Boston, that you watch has a degree in atmospheric science. And so, while it might not be our main job to be a climatologist, which is a little bit different, of course, it's something that we do watch every day. We watch the trends, we read the research, and we try to be well versed in what's happening, not just here, but around the globe as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we go about that, some of the trends that we've seen, and also some of the things that we've seen locally, because every part of the world reacts a little bit differently in seeing their own types of issues or things that they're going to have to adapt to or adjust to going forward in the future. So I'm going to share my screen here, disappear for a little bit, and then we can talk a little bit more after that. So start it up. Weathering New England here. So I thought we'd start first with some of the best and worst of Boston weather. This is an amazing place to be a meteorologist because we get everything. There's nothing that we really don't deal with in terms of weather except for dust storms. And if we're dealing with dust storms, we got problems. Our hottest temperature here in Boston is 104 degrees. Our coldest temp was 18 below zero. So that's a pretty impressive range. If you're looking for the biggest range anywhere in the lower 48, though, you're gonna have to go to the Great Plains. That's where they can really see some unbelievable swings in temperature. Our strongest wind gusts, this is an interesting one because it wasn't actually measured. Most people think that it was 186 miles per hour at Blue Hill Observatory. That was during the great New England hurricane 1938. And it was something that they estimated basically at their peak winds before their anemometer broke, and also measuring how fast the clouds were moving. There's a different type of science there to try to figure out exactly what might be going on the ground. But that was our biggest wind event. Our major storm surge in Boston, we had the perfect storm in 1991. We had the blizzard of 78, which everyone knows about around here. And more recently, in March of 2018, we actually set the high water mark. And you might say, well, I don't remember that storm as much as the blizzard of 78. And that ties into our climate conversation because that storm, being weaker than the blizzard of 78, was able to break the water level record because the water is higher than it was in the 70s as sea level continues to rise. And so a storm surge that was a little bit less than you might have seen in some of the biggest storms in the past was able to eclipse that and cause a whole host of issues in the Boston waterfront. And our snowiest winter on record, that was a recent one too, 2014-15 with 110.6 inches of snow. So one thing that comes with the weather is well, I guess it's not just weather anymore. It's basically some sensationalization that goes on with the news. Everything has to get the biggest headline, a lot of attention, the millions of people in a tornado zone. And sometimes it becomes difficult, I think, to figure out Are things really that much worse? Are they that much more active? What's going on in the weather? Because our media environment has changed so much. We also have cameras everywhere now, which has been wonderful as a meteorologist because we see everything. Things that you thought were a little bit more rare, now you get pictures from every year. And so people can share these things that take place, different types of weather and storms and skies. And that's been a great thing. There's been more news play, there's more news cycle. And of course, the climate debate is something that's always ongoing out there. But one thing we can't really debate is that the world is getting warmer. So September was the warmest September on record for the globe. October, I believe, came in 4th or 5th. They just had the breakdown the other day there. But that makes 430 straight months where the globe has been warmer than the mid-century average, going back into the 1900s. You still get cool pockets, as you can see, but in general, it's been a consistent, steady climb upward as greenhouse gas emissions continue. We do see that here in New England as well. So the best site for climate in New England, and really maybe all of the eastern seaboard, is Blue Hill Observatory. So they're in Milton, just outside of Boston. And what makes this such a great place, it hasn't moved, which is important. Sometimes people don't realize that a place like Boston, the measurements haven't always been taken in the same place. So since 1936, they've been at Logan Airport, but before that, they were around the financial district, and there are a number of different spots. They were on rooftops for a while. They were in the edge of an office building for a while. They've been all over the place, and that can make a difference on the temperature record. Same story in Worcester. They used to be downtown, but now they're up at the airport. The airport's at 1,000 feet. Downtown is lower elevation, so that can change the numbers. Blue Hill Observatory has always been the same spot since back into the 1800s. And it also is surrounded by trees, which is helpful because you don't get a lot of environmental change around it. And so that can make for a much more consistent look at how things have gone. And you can see very easily here on the graph that things have warmed up pretty considerably. We've gone from average temperature there of a little over 7 degrees Celsius to now a running mean that's approaching 10 degrees Celsius. And it may not sound like a lot, but if you consider the last ice age, the global temperature was about 5-6 degrees Celsius cooler than now. It doesn't take a whole lot to create a different kind of environment for us. And so the stats there at Blue Hill certainly bear that out. Something that I've kind of tracked here at WBZ are these top 10 months. So basically we're looking throughout the record and we're saying, okay, how many months are in the top 10 coldest and how many are in the top 10 warmest? These are the months that really stick out, or the seasons that really stick out. And in just the last 10 years, we've had 40 top 10 warmest months and 1 top 10 coldest. That one was February of 2015, which we all remember very well. That one definitely stuck out. We also had our 1st, 3rd, 4th, and 5th warmest winters. We had our 1st, 2nd, and 9th warmest springs, our 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 7th warmest summers, our 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 8th warmest autumns, and our 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 8th, and 9th warmest years. And we're looking to be in that top 10 again this year. So it's hard to argue with all those stats there. At Blue Hill Observatory, the last 10 years have easily been the warmest on record, and we're constantly favoring those warmer times. It's not that we don't get cold months. It's not that we don't get cold stretches or even cooler years, but the odds largely now favor warmer than average and even record warm conditions. And we do see that nationwide. If you look at the departures from kind of a ratio, record cold, record heat. If everything was stable, right, they would just be about the same. But if you go throughout the months, you see that in all months, record highs outpace record lows across the United States. And you see that signal, especially in terms of the US in summertime and fall time. This is a look at the national trends in the high heat. So basically heat wave frequency or the warm season length, how many days, and you can see the growth around the edges and into the Midwest. And where you do see a little bit of a hole is across the Great Plains. And so this is kind of a lesson in, doesn't mean that every single place is reacting the exact same way. Where we do see some resistance to warming are kind of the interior parts of continents. So there's a little spot here in the United States, and then there's a little spot that's out into Asia that's away from the oceans and kind of locked in the middle that haven't seen the same aggressive warming trends as everywhere else. Certainly you see more of the warming trend, but there are still some holdouts out there. This is something that we're going to talk about as we head into the winter outlook here and how this year is going to end up. So El Nino which is a warming or a cooling of the Pacific, the equatorial Pacific, is something that happens naturally. It happens all the time. Warm years tend to be El Nino years, like we had in 2015 and 16. If you have a good weather memory, you remember that December was outrageous. We were in the 50s and 60s the entire time. It was raining. It just obliterated the warmest December on record. And El Nino did that, and El Nino gave us that extremely warm year globally when you look at the whole picture. But what we see now is a year like this year, where there's La Nina, we're still setting record warmth. So current La Ninas are warmer than past El Ninos. And that speaks to how much warmer the ocean has gotten. This year is expected, with a little more than a month to go here, to be the first or second warmest year on record for the planet. And that's with La Nina. And that's definitely a flashing signal out there. And we see the water warming here in New England, not just out in the Pacific. The Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming water bodies on the entire planet. And how that affects things is that you start to see more of a shift in the animals that live there. So we can track how lobsters are moving, fish are moving. I'm a big fan of these biological markers. So if you're skeptical of the thermometers, placement, record keeping, all of that, at the very least, you can just look at what's happening with nature, because nature is going to react either way, and it doesn't really care what our record keeping says. It knows what's happening. So we've seen lobsters move north. We've seen a lot of these tropical fish starting to show up more. This also can extend our tornado season and our tropical season. If you don't have cold water offshore, then you have a little bit more energy for those types of storms. So what's causing all this? You can look at a number of factors. And if you're trying to figure out why the globe is warming or cooling, climatologists are studying what we call radiative forcing, basically. There's all these different things out there that can affect how warm or cold the planet's getting. Things like greenhouse gases, which without, we wouldn't be here. So you do need an element of that. Aerosols, which are things like volcanic eruptions, wildfires, arc pollution in the air that can block sunlight and cause a cooling, and volcanoes, solar activity, and El Nino. And if you look over the last 170 years or so, and you take a look at all these factors, if you look at the aerosols, the volcanoes, El Nino, they would actually suggest that the Earth should be cooling a little bit right now. And we're warming considerably instead, which really points to the fact that it is the greenhouse gases that are causing that warming. We can say the sun isn't the cause because the global temperature is rising, but the solar input is not increasing. The sun's actually pretty quiet right now compared to the last the period in the 1900s where we had a very active sun. If it were the sun, the whole atmosphere would be warming throughout the column, but that's not what's happening. Our troposphere, where we live, is warming, but the stratosphere is not. And the stratosphere is actually getting colder, and that's consistent with greenhouse gas theory. So that's another check in the box for, okay, we know why the planet's getting warmer. And the change from a peak of a sunspot cycle to the bottom is about 0.1%. So there's just not a whole lot of change there. And at Blue Hill Observatory, they measure the same thing, and this is their output. And you can see that solar output's pretty steady stuff. You can get things like the Maunder minimum, the Dalton minimum periods where the globe did cool somewhat. But in general, recently, this would not explain why the world is getting warmer. Kind of talk a little bit more about these biological markers at Blue Hill Observatory. They don't just do the temperature, but they track what's going on the ground. How about the date of the first ripe blueberries? They've got blueberry bushes all over the top of the hill. And so they wait, they look at that blueberry bush that's next to the weather station, and they wait for the first ripe ones, and they mark it down. And you can see that it's arriving earlier on in the year than it used to back in the earlier 1900s. How about ice out dates? This is a New England tradition too. If you're up on Winnipesaukee or if you're farther north, this is Moosehead Lake in Maine. It's a big deal. That's like the party time. You get to the end of winter, that's the end of the season, the last ice leaves the lake, and they mark it down. And they've been doing this for a long time, going back again, over 170 years. If you look at Moosehead Lake, which is not an urban environment at all, it's not contaminated by being near a city or anything like that. Well, it's coming earlier and earlier. Doesn't mean that every year it's going to be early, but the general trend continues to be earlier by more than a couple of weeks now. And if you think about it, say a couple of weeks, well, that's not really that much time. But a couple of weeks on either side of the year, okay, that's a month less winter. And if that trend continues, okay, now we have 2 months less winter, and that's a, you're missing almost half of winter basically at that point. So that can make a big difference on the edges. One thing I also like to talk about when I discuss climate and weather is that there are levels of understanding. It's shades of gray. There aren't just black and white. A warmer world means this, and we know that's the case. This is something from the National Climate Assessment, and it looks at where we have higher confidence of what a warming planet might bring. So at the top of that, the highest confidence is extreme cold and extreme heat. One thing that we are pretty certain of is that we're seeing more heat records. We're seeing fewer cold records. Doesn't mean that's just one or the other. It's just the trend. That ratio is kind of diverting. Then we look at droughts and extreme rainfall, and we've seen patterns in more higher precipitation events and areas that have been drying out. And then you move down and you look at tropical cyclones. Actually, not a lot of research that's definitive on what might happen. The current theory on tropical cyclones is that we might actually see fewer of them on average going forward, but the ones that you get may be stronger, or we might see more rapid intensification. And that's something that really stood out this year. We had a number of rapidly intensifying cyclones. We also have a season that may be extending, starting a little bit earlier and ending a little bit later because the ocean is warmer. So those are the types of trends that we're looking at there. Then at the bottom, we have things like wildfires and severe storms or tornadoes. Wildfires are tricky because people generally start them. And so climate change isn't an ignition point for fires, but what it can do is change fire behavior, because as temperatures warm, if it's very dry and it's hotter than average, you end up drying out those fuels and causing the situation where a fire may grow faster. And we saw that this year as well. The fires in California and Colorado in particular, a lot of the firefighters who've been working for decades said, I haven't seen fire behavior like this before. It was really just chewing through forests, and they had had a very hot summer. In tornadoes, we're really not sure. The jury's kind of out on what may happen with tornadoes. But the heavy precipitation events are definitely of interest to us here. The Northeast in particular has seen a big increase in these types of events. So when it rains, it pours. And when it snows a lot. I've been kind of burned on some snow forecasts lately because I feel like every time it snows, we have thunder, we have lightning, and it snows like crazy. When it rains, all of a sudden you have 5, 6, 7 inches of rainfall and something's washed out. And the relationship that we know of is that for every 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming, the saturation levels increase by about 4%, meaning as air warms up, it has the ability to hold more water. And so it has the ability to dump that water on us. If you've noticed the summers, the dew point trend is rising here in New England, so it is getting more humid. It's been climbing up since 1980. It's added a couple of degrees on average for the summer, and that is something that we saw a couple summers ago in particular. 2018 was just a ridiculously humid summer. We'll look at that in a minute. We've doubled the heavy rain events at Blue Hill Observatory, going back over the last 100+ years. So we continue to see that trend poking up, and it leads to pictures like this. This is one of my favorite spots over at the Beachcomber in Wellfleet, and they got about 6, 7 inches of rain just in a couple hours overnight one night, and the dune came down, and some poor soul had parked their car right on top of it, and that went down with it. We saw a heavy rain event like this in Norwood earlier this year, where the hospital flooded. We had one in Lynn a couple of years ago, where they got 8 inches of rain in a Sunday morning, caused all sorts of flooding. We've had a couple of these in northern New England, where there's been big washouts because of the heavy rain. So this is definitely something that has become an issue for us. And in 2018, I was mentioning the dew points were the big story. We had a record amount of 70-degree dew points. The summer was just, I like heat and humidity. It was gross. It was so humid the entire time. It poured. All those 1s and 2s and 3s you see on that map on the side, those are wettest year on record. So up and down the east into the Midwest, it was just dumping rain and tropical all year long. All right. And toward the end here, I have a few things that we're going to discuss, and then we can do some questions. But one thing I certainly want to talk about here in Boston was sea level rise. And this is a look at inundation events in Boston. So you're basically looking at days where it floods. And if you go back into the 1940s and 50s and 60s, you get some flood days in there. You get a couple big storms, you get some full moon, new moon cycles, and the water comes in. But we've seen a huge increase in flood days. So now we talk about sunny day flooding. King tides, if you will, or even days where it's just a full moon or a new moon and not even really a king tide. you see flooding. And if you add in an onshore wind, you get significant flooding. And if you add in a storm, you get major flooding. That storm in 2018 was kind of a perfect storm of timing, if you will. It was one of those extra high tides. It came in at high tide, and that's how we broke the water level. So that is the record holder, along with January of 2018. So we had 2 storms there that were all the way up the list. Blizzard of 78's on that list. Perfect storm in 91 is also the 3 kind of major storms that we've seen here in Boston, bringing in water. And that goes into the kind of infrastructure conversation, all the development near the water. And I know the city's been trying to be proactive about talking about it and trying to at least do some mitigation in and around the city. This is a beach out in Truro on Cape Cod, which used to be a dune line straight across. Now it breaches almost every time we have a decent storm or a high tide. This is what it looks like now. That's what it looked like in 1900. So you had all these houses, you had a bowling alley, you had, I think, an arcade down there. I can actually go back and show this again. So look at that house that's across the breach. That I go to this beach a lot, and that house probably has a year or 2 left, and it's going to be gone. And look how high up on the hill it was. And all that dune has been eroded, and all those structures are long gone at this point. This was really beat up during the perfect storm, and it's been disappearing ever since. And this is now probably the weakest point in the outer Cape. And some of that sand has been deposited on other beaches. So some are growing out toward the tip of Provincetown. Some of that sand has made its way there. As I mentioned, there's no tornado trend in the US, a significant tornado trend anyway. It's also difficult to parse out because we track these much more efficiently than we used to. There's way more people, there's more chasers, there's more reporting of tornadoes, and it makes it a little harder to figure out exactly how many more or less that you're seeing. But in terms of research, there really hasn't been a big flag as to what's going to happen with tornado behavior, except for maybe a bit of a northward creep as far as where they happen. We can have them here for sure. We've always had them here in New England, but this was an unusual one. This is on Cape Cod in the summer last year. And this was pretty wild. This is a powerful tornado that came on through. And again, having a warmer ocean would make this more likely because usually the ocean air is more stable and it knocks down things like tornadoes. It doesn't really allow them to form in a place like Cape Cod or the islands. But if the ocean's warmer, that can be an issue. And then just looking at the number of tropical systems, pretty steady. If you track them around the world, the number hasn't really moved all that much. We're worried a little bit more about the heavy rain from these, the slower movement, and the rapid intensification. That would be more possible. And our last hurricane, it's been a long time. So this is what we harp on. Hurricane Bob. Last time we had a hurricane make landfall here in New England. So you're going all the way back now, 29 years. That's a long time for New England to avoid a hurricane. So hurricane prep is like the #1 thing that we're interested in. Believe it or not, even as our winters are warming up, snowfall hasn't changed. There's no real trend over the last 30 years in the amount of snowfall. So we haven't lost it yet. There's going to be a point where it gets too warm and it will be harder to keep up these averages. But up to this point, that has not happened. Snowfall is also another tricky thing to track because the way we measure it has changed over time, especially since the 1990s. So there may be some gray area there. So we'll get into the end of my rambling here, and then we can do some questions, which is the fun part. Some takeaways here, more heavy precipitation events. That's a big one for us. The rising seas in our coastal towns, because New England was built on the coast, and certainly that has a lot of our attention. The warmer trend continues to advance. We want to plan for that next hurricane because it's certainly coming, and I don't think winter is going to disappear on us. We're always going to have winter here, but they're certainly getting warmer. And we have a network of weather watchers at WBZ. I have to update my picture here. We've had a lot of changes this year, but no one's been in the office. We had Barry and Danielle, and they both retired, actually. So now it's me and Terry, but we also have Sarah Robleski, Jacob Wyckoff, and Zach Green as part of the team. But you can always find us on WBZ, as well as online on Twitter and Instagram and email. And after that, I think I'll stop and I'll take some questions and we can do a little Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. That was awesome. I know I've always been fascinated by the weather, and I really appreciate the educational reporting that meteorologists like you provide, especially when
trying
it
to do
comes
more
to
than just
climate.
like, the sun and the snow icons and moving on in the hour by hour. We try to mix in a little science too.
Yeah, it's great. So as Eric said, we're going to move into the question and answer portion of the webinar. As a reminder, if you think of questions while we're still going, please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But we're getting quite a few already, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to start out with a question that I imagine is probably on everyone's mind. Could you talk a little bit about the weather that we've been having this year? I know with the pandemic, everyone's probably been spending quite a bit more time outside. And, so what were summer and fall like? And, what is that going to tell us about what we might be in store for this winter?
Well, this year has actually been amazingly quiet, and I feel like we needed it, right? People were looking for a chance to get outside, and this year definitely provided it. It's been one of our drier years on record. Right now we're at 19th driest up to this point, so it's not historically dry, but it's certainly been drier than the norm. And it's been a warm year. Really the only cold stretch that we've had this year was April into early May. And at the time it was a little frustrating because, we were dealing with kind of that first big round of the pandemic, but it helped everyone hunker down, that's for sure. And we're sitting in the top 5 for warmest year on record here in Southern New England. Providence is at 2nd and Boston sitting at 5th right now. And Worcester's at 2nd or 3rd at last check. And so this year we really haven't had, I'm thinking of like memorable weather events this year. It was the snow that came before Halloween, and it was the derecho show that came right before that, where we had that big wind event that blew on through. So October had the more interesting weather events, but other than that, I mean, it has not been busy in the weather office for this particular year.
Totally fair.
We'll
awesome.
take the break.
yeah. I mean, it's been great to get outside. So we've got a question from the audience. How does one become a meteorologist? And while you're talking about it, what are some of your favorite parts of being one?
A lot of meteorologists have like the same story, and it's that you just knew. You were a kid, you were 5 or 6 years old, and you were already geeking out at whatever storm was outside the window, or you're checking out the lightning and measuring the snow and calling in the TV station. And I was one of those kids. I just always was interested in it. My mom bought me weather books. She got me a little weather station for the backyard. I kept an observation diary. I ended up if you go my yearbooks from 5th and 6th grade, there's notes in there from friends saying, can't wait to see you on TV as a meteorologist. I took all the science classes and all the math classes and went to college for the same thing. And here we are. It just happened to work out. But that's a very common story. I know that Barry Burbank, his story was that he was terrified of the weather. He remembers Hurricane Carol, and it scared the bejesus out of him. And so he wanted to understand more about it. Mish Michaels was the same way. She had a tornado in her town. She was so scared of severe weather. And so she ended up starting to study it more. And then she ended up being a meteorologist. And for Danielle, it was Hurricane Bob and Gloria when they came through. So we all have kind of like that moment.
Yeah, that's awesome. So turning our attention to climate change a little bit, we have a question from Dan who says, belief in anthropogenic climate change among the meteorological community seems to vary. Some accept it wholeheartedly, some remain skeptical, at least as of a few years ago. Why is this?
Well, I think, in science, it's good to be skeptical. Science is all about skepticism and then testing things and then hopefully, learning along the way and figuring things out. I would say that even myself, I was skeptical when I was younger. When I was just starting out in meteorology, I was like, there's no way. I mean, how could, in a powerful planet, how could people be really changing it? And after you do the research and then you follow the trends, it becomes pretty obvious, I think. And I know a number of other meteorologists who have said the same thing. We were just talking about this online the other night. And sometimes it's the most vocal people who talk about it now. Were ones that were skeptical 15 years ago. I think that if you really dig into it and you have an open mind, it's tough to find any evidence to say that it's not happening and that people are not the reason why the world is warming up. But we know kind of the world that we're living in right now. A lot of people find their position, they dig into their trench and they're not going anywhere, it's tough, right? So skepticism, I think, is healthy, but I think the vast majority, most meteorologists believe that the world's warming up and that humans are the main driver of that trend.
Thanks. And so, in a related question from someone else, do you work with other folks in regions where climate science might be more controversial to help educate people about how the climate is changing? Or do you know of good techniques to engage with those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So around here, obviously, people are a little bit more um, willing to talk about it and have that conversation. In fact, they're just asking for more of that conversation. They're much more receptive. I know meteorologists in different parts of the country that get horrible emails or death threats, or their management in their own station is like, "Don't talk about that again."
Wow.
That does exist in many other parts of the country. And so it can be very challenging. At some of our weather conferences, they'll come out and they'll do a presentation. They'll share some of the emails and the tweets and the backlash that they get for even bringing it up. And so some have gotten more creative. It's kind of in the marketing, the packaging, if you will. If you're in a different part of the country, you need to talk to what people care about, where their jobs are, and you need to be sensitive to how they're going to view things. If you're talking about renewable energy, or you're talking about how rain may change or drought may change, and you're in an agricultural area, that's going to strike a chord more than, New York City's flooding. Look at Hurricane Irene, Sandy, it's underwater. No, I don't care. I don't live in New York City. So you need to talk about how it's going to affect their livelihoods and what kind of changes are going to happen, or have already happened in those towns. So there's a little bit of a massaging of the marketing that has to take place depending on who you're talking to, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've really got the questions like pouring in. We've got quite a few questions about sea level rise, so I'm going to try to get to a bunch of those. So some folks are interested about whether or not we can predict the rate of sea rise in Boston, on Cape Cod, and if so, do we have those numbers?
Yeah, so we do have those numbers. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the rate has been in the last few years. I know that the water level's up about a foot in the last 100 years. So we could say a little less than an inch a year around Boston, but it's uneven. It's not always the same every single year. We know that the outer Cape is eroding at a rate of about 3 to 4, sometimes 5 feet per year. So you can kind of do the math on that. If you have a house, there's a reason some of these oceanfront houses on top of dunes on outer Cape Cod that are absolutely glorious either don't sell, or they're for sale for $300,000 versus a house that's inland. It's going to fall in the ocean. There's no doubt about that. Right. And sometimes it can be a little deceiving because the outer Cape always looks the same. Sometimes the coast, if you went to it and then you revisited it in 30 years, it would look the same because its face is the same, but it's just closer to Route 6. So it's always marching backward, and it's kind of erasing its traces over time. But we do know what that rate is. It's about 4 feet per year on the outer Cape. And then there's the unknowns. We know what has happened. We can model what's going to happen going forward, but some of that is really contingent on some big events. It's what happens in Greenland and the melting there. It's what happens in, does a piece of the shelf collapse? Is there some cataclysmic change in one particular region? And that's real. I mean, you could model it and say this is the worst case scenario, but you don't know if it's going to happen next year, 10 years, or 30 years from now.
Mm-hmm. And so we've had a couple questions too about, when are the, do we have a prediction of when we might end up with a flooded Boston because of sea level rise?
I think 2018, because we had water in the north end and the west end, and we had the seaport, we had dumpsters rolling down the street because we picked up the seawater. And now I know Boston Harbor now does a good job of broadcasting the king tides and the high tide flooding, the sunny day flooding that happens a lot of the time. And I know that the mayor and the state, they've talked more about being more resilient and adding in these buffer areas. And a lot of the new structures in the seaport, some of them have like gates that come up on their bottom level to protect flooding. Some of them have put all their mechanicals higher up in the building. Some of them have floors that are basically meant to flood. I mean, they expect to flood. And so they have the first couple of floors like, this fills with water, we'll be okay. We can clean it up. I don't think that's ideal. But in terms of a timeline, I mean, you're talking inches of the next 20 years for the most part, right? So it's not something that's so dramatic. but it's something that you will start to notice. And then one day you wake up and you're saying, wow, it floods here a lot, which is what they do in Miami now. Basically every time there's a new moon or a full moon, there's just the ocean's in the street. They go, oh, we got a problem. So that's kind of where we're headed, but it's tough to talk about some of these things because they do happen at a somewhat gradual pace compared to our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of flooding, do you have any recommendations for hurricane preparedness that can be done as a community, not just on the individual level? How do you get communities and local governments to invest money and manpower in kind of preparing for these changes?
It's a good question. I think a big thing that came, especially after 2011 and 12, is trimming and maintaining and not having things that are really susceptible to falling trees and power grid issues. I mean, that's our biggest issue, is that when we get an actual strong hurricane here again, I mean, power is going to go out for a month, if not more, in some areas. There are so many trees in New England, and they're all over neighborhoods and in industrial areas. And I know they've tried to really ramp up a lot of the tree trimming, but that's, like, to me, going to be the biggest issue with the next ones. How long the power's out, how much work it's going to take to get that back up and going. A generator is certainly a great idea to have if you have the money to invest in one. Having that peace of mind post-hurricane would be excellent. And then it's just talking to communities about, I think Sandwich has been moving its municipal buildings, their fire department and their police station, because they flood so frequently now. That's more of a nor'easter issue than a hurricane issue, but it's an example of being mindful of what the ocean's going to do in the future. And then, I mean, you can talk to people about where it's a great idea to live and where it's not so good of an idea. But if people are going to take the risk at some point too. If you live in, Buzzards Bay, it's beautiful. Why wouldn't you? If you could live right on the water there, great. But at some point, a hurricane is going to shove a lot of water into those areas. It's happening. Putting flood inundation info and evacuation info, and I think that's important stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And one more related to sea level rise, is the FEMA flood map system being updated as frequently as it should be done given the frequency of these events?
They did a big update after Sandy, so that's pretty recent, much to the chagrin of a lot of homeowners because they found out that they were now in a floodplain, and that was very expensive. I think that they're addressing it probably, I don't know. I don't know what the right answer to that is, to be honest. It's not my expertise wheelhouse to say how often they should be updating the flood maps, but they have had a fairly recent update.
Good to know. And so some questions about the effects that climate change might be having, especially in the Northeast. Do you have any theories on why the Gulf of Maine is warming more than elsewhere?
Good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that, the oceans in general, you watch the trends and they're pretty consistent about everywhere, but there are pockets where things happen unevenly. Well, on the other side of the coin, there's a North Atlantic cold blob that's been sitting south of Greenland for years. And we don't know if maybe if the Gulf of Maine is something where if the Gulf Stream is slowing down some, are there more eddies that are spinning off of it and then now finding their way spinning into the Gulf of Maine and adding some of that warmer tropical water? Is it the fact that it's just warmer across the Northeast now than it used to be, and so we're seeing that warming? Is it a little easier to warm up water that's cold than water that's already warm? If you're at the equator, it's tough to get a bigger anomaly because it's already getting its max solar output compared to the higher latitudes. So sometimes we see those biggest anomalies in the higher latitude spots, places like the North Pacific and also into the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah, and I know that's something we talk about quite a bit, especially with a lot of our fishermen partners and the changes that they're seeing in ocean temperatures and the effects that's having on, what they're able to catch. And I know you mentioned, the lobsters are moving farther north, a lot of fish are too. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of those changes, with a lot of people we work with.
I had a guy email me a few weeks ago. He said he caught a triggerfish off of Cape Cod. It's like, what? And that's a tropical fish.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be hanging out up here.
Yeah, things are changing. In a related note, we've got a couple of questions about even though the fact that temperatures are rising, are we seeing that result in more accented seasons? And I think you talked about this a little bit with like the hotter summers, rainy seasons. People wanted to make sure to see if you can kind of explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so the biggest rate of warming that we've seen here in New England has been during the winter and the fall. So those are the two seasons where that signal is greatest. 11 of our 12 months have been warming up over the last, so when they come out with new 30-year averages, that will happen next year. So right now we're working off the averages of 1981 to 2010. It'll move to 1991 to 2020. 11 of the 12 months are going to warm except for one. Do you want to guess which one?
I don't know.
I think it'll be a surprising one. It would not be one that most people would guess. June.
Okay.
June, for whatever reason. It could just be like stochastic. It could be just noise in the overall signal, but June is the one. But we see the biggest magnitude of warming in the winter and the fall. But in summer, you don't need as much of a magnitude change. So we've seen hot summers. We've seen some of our hottest in just the last few years. But what I mean by that is that the summer doesn't have the biggest swing. So basically fall can be way up here or way down here. The standard deviation in the summer is way smaller. So you could have a summer that's just 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees warmer than average, and that's gets you to record territory. And we've also really noticed a shift, like as if summer is shifting 2 weeks later. That's something that's really popped in the last 10 to 20 years or so.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it feels like it's kicking in just a little bit later and it's lasting through September, and then fall starts in October.
Yeah.
And I don't have a great reason for that. I don't know if it's been fully researched and we have a strict answer on it, but definitely that's been something a lot of people have commented on in recent years.
Yeah. I know. I've only lived out here for a little bit, but I think I've noticed that too, that it seems to be shifting even in the 8 or so years that I've been here.
Yeah, it's very odd.
Yeah. In a related note about fall, could you comment on the foliage season changes in Massachusetts?
Yeah, on average, it's been trending later. There's only so much you can move the foliage season. Basically, foliage, it's largely dependent on daylight. The trees are going to respond to the lack of daylight more than anything else, but weather can change it. And I think it's about 2 weeks. 2 weeks is probably the limit for how much you can change leaf out or the foliage season in the fall time. Generally, we've been seeing it moving later. I feel like every year I'm saying expect a late foliage season this year. This year we didn't actually say that because of the drought, because the trees were a little stressed. And then we had a pretty good cold shot in mid-September, and it kind of got the ball rolling. The leaves ended up hanging on a good amount of time. We still had great color well into October, but it got started a little bit earlier. But normally, Columbus Day used to be, in my memory, Columbus Day was the peak weekend in like Western Mass and Connecticut. And now it's the peak weekend in New Hampshire and Vermont. We were up in New Hampshire for Columbus Day weekend and it was gorgeous.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a tree outside my window that's, lost all its leaves on the top, yellow in the middle and green on the bottom. It's November. Yeah,
they're definitely holding. I know the landscapers have gotten really annoyed by it because they're doing fall cleanups in December. It's definitely extended their season too.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, moving into winter, you mentioned there was not a change in the amount of snowfall, but what about snow depth? Are we seeing a quicker decrease in snow depth after our large snow events?
It's a variable that I wish we had better record keeping on. Anecdotally, yes. It's tougher to keep a snowpack. Doesn't mean it's the case every year. 2014, 15 winter, obviously we did a pretty good job of retaining the snow that fell for a while. But in general, I know they did do a study out of Plymouth State up in New Hampshire, which has a meteorology program where ski areas basically commissioned this research into snowmaking conditions. Basically, how many days is it primed to make snowfall and how easy is it to retain their snow? And they did find a pretty significant decrease in the amount of snowmaking days. So it gets a little bit harder for them. A lot of them have really When we talk about adaptation, they've really invested in snowmaking. They spend millions of dollars and much better equipment to really maximize that end of the business, because it's not quite as reliable to just wait for nature to do its thing. Again, these things are trends. They're not rules for every single year. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I know that's a story that we like to use to kind of demonstrate the on-the-ground effects of climate changes, is the effect that it's having on, folks who run, ski resorts, especially in the Northeast, and, when they can't depend on regular snow, having to invest, considerable amounts of money. That's hard.
Yeah, you think a lot of like local mountains, the big ones, they're fine. They have their elevation, but some of the smaller ones, like they wouldn't exist without expensive snowmaking. Mountain like Wachusett even last year, they couldn't have opened. It didn't snow.
Yeah.
So if they didn't have great snowmaking, they would have gone right out of business. And there are years like that, especially for our southern New England ski areas.
Yeah. What about wind speeds? One of our attendees says it's his impression that wind speeds have increased over the past 20 years. Do we have any data on this?
Actually decreased in the past 20 years. Blue Hill does keep track of their average wind speed, and they have found a decreasing trend over time. And they actually found this over in England as well, another observatory that's been tracking the winds. They call it global stilling. So something that they're looking at, and that actually might make some sense, because if you were going to warm up the planet, and we know that higher latitudes warm faster than equatorial regions or lower latitudes, then you're decreasing the overall thermal gradient of the planet. So in theory, I guess that would make some sense to see it. Now, it's not something you would really notice, I don't think, day to day, but what we can say basically is that there hasn't been any increase in wind.
So what are some of the most important factors that have increased our ability to forecast weather accurately? This attendee remembers when forecasts for more than a day or two into the future were questionable. Now even 5-day forecasts can be quite accurate.
Yeah, accuracy, I mean, we're sure the butt of all the jokes. It's fine, you can take it. But the accuracy has changed dramatically over time. And even just myself as a kid, I mean, I'm not that old, getting there, but as a kid watching the news, like the mornings I would wake up and be completely disappointed that a forecast was terrible because the snow never came and it just rained, or the amounts were totally off. Granted, it still could be wrong sometimes, but those major busts, those don't happen with any frequency anymore. The big thing for that has been computer models. They have helped us out so significantly. They can see farther out into the future. They have higher resolution, higher computing power. They're still not perfect. They're certainly still wrong. We say all models are wrong. Some are useful. So we use them as tools to forecast, but that has become a big ace in your pocket. And not just that, but having better observation systems and satellites. We take for granted now the things that we see via satellite are out of this world compared to anything you would see back even in just the early 2000s or the 90s. Satellite data is a huge part of computer models. Most of what goes into computer models is from a satellite. So as those satellites get better and higher resolution and they track different things, you can end up getting a better forecast out of it. But I think especially with these last few hurricane seasons, the images that we've seen, you can track, mesovortices, things spinning around in the eye of a hurricane. And our radar has been updated in the last 10 years where you can easily spot tornadoes now. It's just all these tools have gotten so fine that it allows us to make a better forecast. But you still can use some of the old tricks that help kind of beat the models sometimes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of tornadoes, I have a question from Jim who says, when he was a kid, tornadoes seemed to be a summer thing confined mostly to Tornado Alley. Now they seem to be more year round and in locations all over the US. Is that true?
I don't think there's been a big change in tornadoes. I think that there's way better reporting of tornadoes. So a lot of them would have been missed, even 20 years ago, but certainly farther back than that. Now, between cell phone video, just having more people around, between the much higher resolution radar, we definitely have more tornado warnings. That is for sure. And the reason for that is because of that dual pole radar that they installed back in the early 2010s. That allows the weather service and meteorologists like us to really see inside a storm with a much better resolution and warn on them. Now we can see storms that are rotating way easier than ever before. And so there are certainly more warnings. in terms of the totals, the averages really haven't changed all that much here in New England. We've always had them. They definitely are more of a talking point now, I think, because we can outlook for them. Forecasts have gotten to the point where 3 days out, we say, that setup looks like we might have something spinning around here. And then you get the day of and you get the tornado watch and then you get the warning and then it becomes a whole thing. Whereas in the past, I think one would just, if you didn't hit a neighborhood, if it spun up and went through the woods somewhere, then like 5 days later, you might hear from the guy who was walking in the woods and saw the tornado damage and you go, oh yeah, tornado touchdown. So that's changed a lot.
Yeah. Shifting a little bit to something else that we might want to be concerned about. Do we have any data on the impact on mosquito season and changes in mosquito-borne disease because of warming? And related, we have a couple other questions about, other kind of insects and pests and the impacts on those populations.
Yeah, I think even more than mosquitoes, which we have seen, obviously, some bad mosquito seasons, and Triple E is a thing, although Triple E has been around for a while. So I don't know that the climate has been a big driver of that, but I think ticks in particular have become a big problem without really harsh winters. And again, I go back to the point that we still have them sometimes, but more often than not, it's not that harsh. You end up with these very large populations. It's been really bad for the moose up in northern New England. I know they've been really struggling with tick-borne illness and for people. And we're seeing a creep of some different types of tick-borne illness. The Lone Star tick showed up in the last couple of years, is now making its home on the South Coast in the Cape. That's something that was more of a southern tick before. So that is, I think, one of the bigger biological marker issues that we're watching. If you don't have these harsher winters, those pests they're becoming a bigger problem.
Yeah. Back to oceans, will continuing increases in ocean temperatures affect the Gulf Stream, and how could that have further impacts?
The biggest research on the Gulf Stream is seeing if it's slowing down. We have a current in the Atlantic called the AMOC, the Atlantic Multidecadal Overturning Current, I believe. And so if that slows down, the biggest issue would be that the Gulf Stream transports a lot of tropical heat energy toward Europe. Europe, I think sometimes we forget is higher latitude than us by a good amount. And so it would be a very cold place without some of that oceanic warmth that comes toward them from the Gulf Stream and that overturning current. And so if that slows down, it becomes less effective, then it could actually turn them a lot colder over time. But a lot of research is going into the speed of that ocean current and how it may affect the planet going forward. But yes, it's probably a big concern.
And we've still got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to pick a couple more to wrap up today. We got a couple questions about the increase in cyanobacteria and other harmful algal blooms because of warming waters. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I feel like it starts cropping up in June every year now, or July, and you can't let your pets in the water. We had it up in Vermont earlier this summer. We get in the Charles River every year now. And so when you have this more stagnant, warm water, it's easier for these bacteria to flourish. We also get more fish kill-offs when they get basically asphyxiation because there isn't enough oxygen in the water because it gets so warm and all this bacteria is growing in there. So that's certainly another thing that we look at as a biological marker. If it's going to be warmer in the summer, if it lasts longer, then you're going to end up having these harmful blooms. It's also tied into runoff. It's a pollution issue. In the Great Lakes, they have so much runoff into the Great Lakes that they have these huge algae blooms now that are causing big issues for them on Ontario and Erie in particular.
Yeah. And I know that some of that is work that we're doing in the Long Island Sound, in our Connecticut and New York chapters. So definitely a biological marker and definitely something that we're hoping to tackle. So with extreme heat and general summer temperatures rising in Massachusetts, how seriously should we be thinking about retrofitting buildings with AC and helping vulnerable communities with less access to cooling options?
Yeah, I mean, air conditioning is so much more widespread now. The growth of air conditioning in the Northeast is off the charts. Basically, they don't build houses without AC anymore. If it's new construction, it's in there. So I think it's becoming less of an issue. Air conditioning is also, unfortunately a feedback because once you have all the air conditioners humming,
Right.
you're increasing heat. But yeah, I think that air conditioning is the way to get through the summer at this point.
Yeah.
We see in the summer more the nights being an issue
Hmm.
as the humidity tends to creep up and we're having more warm nights where it's tougher to cool off. That's where it stresses out your body. It's not necessarily, our summer temps are mostly 80s and 90s. That's not the worst thing to have to live through. But the nights, if you're staying in the 70s, that really stresses the body out when it doesn't get a break. And so air conditioning, that's why they have the cooling centers, but certainly all the new construction now, they don't even bother without AC. And certainly not in the South or the plains or the West Coast. They're building it in, unless you're in like coastal Washington or Oregon. Maybe even there, they're doing more of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're coming down to the end here. Let's end on a fun question. What's the most unusual weather event you've observed? And what's your favorite kind of weather?
Most unusual one. Unusual. I can tell you what the most memorable one was. And that was the tornado super outbreak back in 2011. Unbelievable. If you're a New England person, you see a tornado every once in a while, but these big ones, it boggles your mind. The amount of damage, what they do to steel beams and cars and neighborhoods, it's unbelievable. So that was the most memorable for me. I don't know if it's unusual. I mean, the scope of the day was certainly unusual, but that'll stick out in my mind. My favorite kind of weather, I don't know. It was always snowstorms, and now I'm getting old and crotchety, and now I think it's thunderstorms. It always was. It still is. When you're in a good snowstorm, it's fantastic because it just changes the world, and you wake up and it looks totally different. But in terms of forecasting, I've gotten more into we call convection or thunderstorms in recent years. I don't know why. I don't know. We change.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm with you there on the thunderstorms. So we're approaching the end of our time today. Do you have any final thoughts or takeaways you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I know. A lot of times we do these talks and people are like, okay, now what? And it's a tough one to answer because what do you do if you think it's a problem? So what kind of action can you take? I feel like I fall more in the adaptation category. You can still, of course, lobby for change when it comes to the bigger picture, greenhouse gas emissions, getting away from fossil fuels, trying to get more into renewables, thinking about your footprint and how much you travel, how much you commute every day, and trying to be a little bit more pedestrian if possible. In terms of adaptation, it's keeping in mind, how you build, how you go about your job, where you might want to go on vacation. Those places are changing, and what you're going to need to do to be successful in those spots is changing as well. So we talk to a lot of public works departments. It's planning for the water by ocean, water by rainfall. When we do preparedness on hurricanes, it's talking about how, hey, our hurricane season up here may go as long as the end of October now, because as the ocean warms up, that window's growing. We're going to get hit. So it's just knowing that inevitability is there. If you want to live near the coast, it's watching the trends, knowing your flood zone, thinking about, okay, do I want to have all my mechanical stuff in the bottom of the house? Is it something where I need to elevate my house? Is it something where I shouldn't maybe live here? Like, is it worth it to live here? Everyone has to take their own risk and make their own decisions to those sorts of things. That's kind of where I'm at with action. It's everyone can do something individually, but the big picture is just trying to get away from the greenhouse gases that cause this warming.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and all of your great questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to get to all of them. We really appreciate your support of the Nature Conservancy. And it's your support that makes all of this work possible. So just to let everyone know, we'll be sending you a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources that Eric mentioned. There were quite a few requests for your PowerPoint, so maybe we can pass that along to folks. They thought it was a great educational tool.
Great.
And yeah, we'll make sure to get you links, as well as I believe in the chat, there's a link to follow Eric on Twitter, where I believe he gives all the latest updates on weather. So thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This was great. I was gonna say, I hope I didn't put too many people asleep here.
No, everyone seemed really engaged. So for everyone watching, if you're enjoying these webinars, please share them with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities like this. After a brief hiatus for Thanksgiving next week, you can join us on December 3rd at noon for a conversation with Kelsey Worth, co-founder of Mothers Out Front. She was inspired to start the group after becoming a mother and feeling despair about how climate change will impact her children's lives. You can find the latest webinar schedule and registration links at nature.org/MA webinars. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. And thank you again, Eric.
Thank you. Bye.